This week's episode is sponsored by Samsung.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Alan Weitz.
And I'm Jill Waterman.
And don't be surprised if our audio engineer, Mike Weinstein, pops in with a question or two somewhere along the line. And that's okay because it seems his doctors finally got his meds right. Two of our highest ranking shows over the past several months have to do with the rapidly evolving and endlessly contentious topic of AI, or synthetic imaging, as today's guest likes to call it. In 1840, the influential French painter Paul Delaroche viewed his first photograph and proclaimed, "From today, painting is dead." To keep our finger on the pulse of what can very well be the hottest topic since that dark day back in the 19th century, we're turning to an undisputed expert. For more than 40 years, the renowned writer, photo editor, and educator Fred Ritchin has been keeping tabs on the momentous changes occurring within the realms of photography and digital media. We'll give you the full scoop on Fred in a second, but first, a small request from all of us to all of you. As we mentioned the other week, our show was recently added to the B&H Photos YouTube channel, conveniently placed under the podcast tab. So let's start talking. I'm going to start things off by posting a remark about this very episode. Once I do, I'd like you to add your voice to the conversation too. We'll be monitoring the discussion as it builds, and we'll give our favorite entries an on-air shout-out as part of an upcoming show. We'd like to think of the B&H Photography Podcast as a collaboration with our listeners, and we consider each of you an intrinsic part of our show. We couldn't do this podcast without you, and your engagement is truly appreciated. Now, back to our guest. Fred Ritchin is Dean Emeritus of the School at the International Center of Photography. Prior to ICP, he was a professor of photography and imaging at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. We also taught in the Interactive Telecommunications program. Additionally, he's a former picture editor of the New York Times Magazine and former executive editor of Camera Arts Magazine. In the mid-90s, he created the first multimedia version of the New York Times, as well as the website Bosnia, Uncertain Paths to Peace, in collaboration with photographer Gilles Perez. This site was nominated by the New York Times for a Pulitzer Prize in Public Service, but then rejected by the Pulitzer Committee because the photographs did not appear on paper. They were electronic, and pixels didn't count back then. Things have changed. In 1999, Ritchin co-founded Pixel Press, an online publication experimenting with new methods of storytelling and collaborating with humanitarian organizations on media projects. More recently, he created the Four Corners Project, an innovative strategy to provide more context and ethical grounding for the photograph online. Ritchin has written and lectured internationally about the challenges and possibilities of the digital media revolution. His books on the future of imaging include In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution of Photography in 1990, After Photography in 2008, and Bending the Frame, Photojournalism, Documentary, and the Citizen in 2013. A new book, The Synthetic Eye, Photography Transformed in the Age of AI, recently went to press and is scheduled for release in October of 2024. Among many other honors, Ritchin has received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Argentinian Documentary Photography Festival and the John Long Ethics Award from the National Press Photographers Association. Fred Ritchin, thank you and welcome to our show.
It's a pleasure.
Before we start, I'm actually going to do something I do all the time. I'm going to go off script. And the reason is that 2 hours ago, I was going through the New York Times, and there's an article about AI. And it's basically had 8 photographs, I think it was. And 4 of them were real, untouched, and 4 were AI. And the whole thing was, can you figure out which are which? And now, again, I'm going to say, I just looked at it on my phone. I did not blow any of the images up. I got 2 wrong in each category.
Mm-hmm.
I got 2 and 2. Like 50% of them I could not get. And 2 of the ones, one fake and one real, truly surprised me because those are the ones I would have put my money on.
Mm-hmm.
It's scary.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where people say, oh, you don't have to worry about AI. You know, everybody has 6 fingers, 7 fingers, and It's just like the beginning of digital when people said the resolution isn't anywhere near as good as film. We don't have to worry about it. And very quickly it was more resolution than film. And they've solved many of these problems. And it's very, very impossible at this point to tell which is an AI image and which is a photograph.
Yeah, except that digital imaging is a lot less dangerous than what we're talking about here today. Let's start by discussing some recent news. Last month, Adobe released a marketing campaign for its software with the tagline, "Skip the photo shoot." Needless to say, this went over like a lead balloon. And the Photography Trade Association, ASMP, responded by issuing an open letter to Adobe denouncing this action. It's also been reported certain Adobe employees have expressed concerns that AI integration into Adobe software may risk cannibalizing the company's own sources of income. But wait, there's more. Just the other day, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Adobe, alleging the company obscures fees and makes it tricky for users to cancel software subscriptions. It seems that Adobe is starting to make Boeing look good. What's your take on this?
I can't get that idea of Boeing looking good out of my mind there. But no, look, it's considerably worse than that. Scott Belsky, who's the chief strategy officer and executive vice president of design at Adobe, he recently said that this is a revolution. This is the new digital camera, and we have to embrace it, talking about AI. The way I see it, we had optical photography, film. It was about light and the lens, and it was dialectical. Whatever it recorded, maybe you looked heavier than you wanted to look or thinner than you wanted to look or whatever it would be. But the photograph was something important. It was evidence, and it could contradict memories. It could stand up to prove things. Was a little girl in Vietnam burning from napalm or not? And the photograph said, yes, that happened. And then it became computational, meaning in the digital era, software was taking over, and whatever light was coming through the lens, the software could override it so that somehow the algorithms come up with what it was supposed to look like, and it enhances the image and so on. And then instead of just overriding the lens, AI now, you don't even need a camera. It's synthetic. You just put in a text prompt and it comes up with a photorealistic image. And that's why I called the first book I wrote, In Our Own Image, The Coming Revolution of Photography, because we were remaking the world in our own image, not the way it was, but the way we wanted it to be. So you have all these filters to make you look a certain way. The thing yesterday, the survey, I think, was something like a third of 18 to 25-year-olds edit the photographs that they put on social media. It's automatic. You want to look a certain way. And going back to your question, I was on the Today Show in 1990 when Adobe announced Photoshop. Tiananmen Square was the year before, 1989. And I said, in this case, the evidence of the photograph was able to override the denials of the Chinese government. And that's not going to happen in the future because of software that manipulates images, makes them malleable, so that it's no longer a credible witness. And unfortunately, that's what's happened. So AI isn't just a new thing. It's part of a progression that's been going on. And I think Adobe has always been a software company interested in the software. And, it's been useful to photographers in certain ways, but it's also in many, many ways diminished the credibility of the field going back 30 plus years ago. So now with AI, you're seeing Shutterstock, Getty, a number of the stock agencies. What is their strategy for making money in the future? It's licensing the imagery to AI companies. It's not about photography. It's about making the money. So I'm not surprised at all that Adobe is doing what it's doing. That's corporate America. It is about the stockholders, about making the money. And we're not necessarily thinking about what it is to be a good citizen.
It's a very, very different world. You brought up the Tiananmen Square, the Tank Man photograph. Now, there's variations of that online, too. Is that due to AI or just good old-fashioned retouching? Because, again, this is nothing new.
I think photography has always had a certain amount of retouching and setting up, but it's an issue of scale. When I started writing about this in 1984, it was a Cytex machine, which I think cost around $500,000 to do it.
Sure.
So it was used very, very rarely. And then 6 years later with Photoshop, it became very expected at that point. The Tank Man was anonymous. Nobody knows who this person was. But if you go to Reddit, for example, there's an AI image of the Tank Man, almost like a selfie of who the guy is. And then on Google's search image, that came up number one when you're looking for Tank Man. So you're distorting history.
So that photograph comes up before the real picture.
But it's not a photograph. It's a synthetic image.
I stand corrected. This synthetic image comes up instead of the actual photograph of the event.
That's correct. And it will more and more because often they're livelier, they're more vivid. And certain studies show that people actually find more credible synthetic images than actual photographs.
What is it about them that makes it more attractive? I mean, is it the fact that you can control every angle and every bit of that frame? That there's nothing left up to that's helter-skelter? It's control? What is it?
I think a lot of the photography that we're used to seeing is almost a template. There are certain ways of photographing. If you photograph a writer, they're in front of the bookcase. If you photograph a politician, they're giving a speech. There's kind of things we do over and over again. And in my experience with AI, they're often surprising. For example, I asked in a text prompt for the greatest mothers in the world, a photorealistic image. And it came up with a synthetic image of what looked like an ape taking care of her children. I never would have assumed it would not be a human. It did something different than I thought it would do. And I often get that kind of feeling. I experiment with it. I want an ethical image of a homeless person, and it comes up with an image that I don't see, a smiling guy, warm, making eye contact instead of this kind of stereotype of a victim that we see all the time. So I think AI can be very idiosyncratic in certain ways. It could be completely wrong. It could be racist, misogynist, and terrible, but it can do things otherwise. Because I think in photography, it's pretty boring often. We see millions and millions of selfies, my breakfast, over and over again, these certain genres that are repeated. AI doesn't do that necessarily. It does other things, especially on a cell phone. When it was a double page in Look magazine, there was all this detail. There is layout, there is typography, there is juxtaposition with other images. But when you're putting an image on a cell phone, it's tiny. It's like a postage stamp. So how much can you do? And I think more and more people make images to fit Instagram or other social media, and they don't use the whole frame. They don't use depth of field in any way that's interesting or tries to reveal something different. Could you imagine Ansel Adams on Instagram? I mean, it doesn't work. It's a whole different scale at that point. So we've reduced photography to the size of a cell phone screen. I think 92% of photographs are being made right now on cell phones, and they're being reproduced and seen that way. When I was picture editor of the New York Times Magazine, we used 3 images on the spread, 4 images, one big one. We control the printing and the color, and we can darken it slightly for drama. And it's a very simplistic medium at this point for the most part. There's a lot of quantity, but not necessarily a lot of innovation.
So shouldn't there be a distinction in that case between photographers and photography? I mean, there's an information overload. Everybody's got a camera in their pocket. And people who make a living at this, or who we consider photographers, should be distinguished then from photography generally.
I agree and disagree. I call those images cell phone images. I don't call them photographs at this point because I'm trying to distinguish exactly your point, which is that when you're working with an actual photograph, with the whole frame, with, again, depth of field, contrast, and so on, there's a lot of control, that's possible. It's the difference in a way between a sketch and a painting. They're not the same thing. But to a certain extent, what we're used to seeing in a lot of professional photography is a kind of over and over again, oh, the bride and groom look amazing. Oh, the product looks amazing. Oh, the advertising is amazing. Oh, the president looks good. But it's not critical. The Americans, Robert Frank, things like that, were very different. They were critical. They were interrogating. They were asking questions. And they were going beyond making things look good. So I think that still exists in a big way, for sure, among professional photographers and amateur photographers as well. But, that's stuff that you see often now in museums and books. We don't have the magazines that would publish it anymore. Often what you see in a slideshow online is, we'll put the first 3 or 4 or 5 exciting images, to get the clicks there. So it's good for the advertising, but it's not sequenced the way it used to be. An opening picture that engages the reader, a second picture advances the narrative, a third picture that maybe contradicts it, the way you make cinema, the way you make a film. That used to be the way we would make photo essays. 8 pages Eugene Smith is very, very different than what you see on social media for the most part, in large part because of the format. The good thing about social media is you get all kinds of opinions, perspectives, people on the spot, billions of people with cell phone cameras. So you see things differently. So those are good things. Those are powerful things. But in many ways, it's a different medium at this point. It's not the same medium that we're used to in the 20th century.
I'd like to take note of 2 points you brought up. Number one, first of all, you were talking about size and scale of looking at images. And you and I, in particular, we've transitioned from the times of large magazines when even like Life magazine was a big magazine. It wasn't just an 8.5, 11 thing that fit into all of the other slots in the magazine racks. And even if you're into music, you bought an LP, you bought an album, and that was a 12 by 12 canvas with a photograph or an illustration. But there was a 12 by 12 inch canvas you could hold in your hand and get a lot of information onto. And then from there, we went to a CD, and it shrank down to 6 by 6. And then it went down to just a little artwork on the iPhone to 2 by 2. So the artwork has gone down. So the images themselves have had to become more simplistic just so we could read them, just to be able to interpret it. And another thing, you kind of dismiss iPhone pictures, and I would say that 99% of them really can be dismissed. Okay, there's no two ways about this. One of the things that I have found is that I learned on a large format camera, 4x5, and there's a look to large format that you cannot replicate with a smaller camera. I went from there to 35, and I found that my pictures were very different. And there were some pictures I could take only on a 4x5 and did, and the rest of them on 35. And it's the same thing now with my iPhone. I find that I take an amazing amount of photographs, and some of them are just records, they're diary, and some of them I compose as carefully as I do with my quote-unquote real camera. And there are some pictures that I know that I cannot take because my favorite photographs are with a 50mm lens at f1.4 or f1.2. That's what I like. I can't do that with my phone. But I use my phone to take the kind of photographs that the phone is capable of doing and is designed to do. I just treat each of the cameras and I say, okay, this is the limitations of what this camera can do. So these are the kind of pictures I'm going to take with this. And yeah, I won't be able to take those ones I really would like to take once in a while.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm a big fan of snapshot photography, amateur photography, the same thing with cell phone photography or imaging. What my problem is that you often see them as individual images. You don't get the ability to build a story.
Understood.
12 pictures, 16 pictures to do it, add text. On picture number 3, you add a little audio, you do this, and then everybody sees it. Like with Life magazine, the millions of copies were all the same. So everybody understood whatever color correction was made or whatever was made on all the issues. Everybody got that. And now, if you're looking at it on this phone or that phone, it may be a different format, the screen or whatever it would be. So it's coming through in different ways. So I think that's certainly important, but it's not the same as what you just pointed out, whether it's large format, a 35mm or whatever it is. You lose a certain control, which in a way is good. It's more spontaneous. Going back, though, to your 12 by 12, 6 by 6 on the CD and the album cover, to this point is when it was a vinyl album, you listen to track 1, then track 2, then track 3. It was done in a sequence for a purpose. And in the digital, all this is made to jump around. And so you're losing sequence. You're losing that linear progression that the 20th century saw. Page 1, page 2, page 3, first picture, second, third, and fourth. If you take the great photo essays, they're built on that kind of sequencing. Now people are used to jumping around, track 7, track 2, track 9. It doesn't really matter anymore. And the same thing with imaging. So if I'm on Instagram, I could jump from this image to that image, to an ad, to this, to that, to the other. And it's difficult to build a sense of atmosphere, to make your point, to have multiple nuances. Take Minamata from Eugene Smith. There's that one famous image of the young woman in the bath who has suffered so terribly from mercury poisoning. If you publish that essay now today, everybody would just run that one picture. It doesn't build up who's responsible for the poisoning. What does it look like in that area of Japan where the other people, you don't build it up. But certainly, I agree with you, many of the iPhone images or whatever cell phone you're using are really, really interesting and worth looking at it.
What comes to my mind is that it used to be we did a presentation, you had a carousel tray for your slides, and you had 80 slots to fill. But you were able to construct a narrative, which is what you're talking about. You're able to tell a story in a sequence. Whereas I guess Instagram, in a sense, is if you just take that slide thing and just turn it upside down into the box and spill them out onto a light table and just randomly say, let's look at pictures.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. When I was picture editor in the New York Times, we wanted to do a special issue. I did exactly what you said. I put the pictures in a carousel. I showed a bunch of editors, and they turned it down. And then I re-sequenced exactly the same images. And a few days later, showed it again. And we did a special issue. The same pictures. But the sequence changed the meaning of the images to make them comprehensible, to make them important. Otherwise, it's just kind of wholesale. You just pick and choose whatever you want, without able to build a narrative, a story, to explore a subject or whatever it is. It's like really the difference between wholesale and retail. Everything deserves to be looked at. But again, we need curators, we need filters, because nobody's going to look at 12 billion images a day or whatever the number is. We need some way to make sense of it. Otherwise, there's just too much of everything, and the important stuff gets lost.
Yeah.
So, Fred, one of your concerns, especially with photojournalism, is that photographers need to take more responsibility for contextualizing their images by adding captions and a code of ethics that you talk about people should add to their website. Can you go into that a little bit more, how you view that as helpful?
Yeah. Over a year ago, we started a campaign called Writing with Light, which is the initial meaning of photography, writing or drawing with light. It was at that time with Magnum Photos, National Press Photographers, with World Press Photo, and some independents. And what we figured out was that just like a writer, the words are not automatically truthful or authentic. It's the writer you have to trust. Is the writer credible? Is the writer insightful? Is the writer an authority? And we decided the same thing now that you can't trust the camera. You have to trust the photographer as an author, just like a writer. Part of it is, well, let's say the photographer, what's your code of ethics? Do you set up images? Do you manipulate them post-production? Do you research the subject? What do you do? What's your approach? You're photographing in Ukraine. Are you Ukrainian? Have you just arrived yesterday? Have you been there before? And so on and so forth, to provide a kind of a context so the reader knows, what are they looking at? And then, I developed a software, which you mentioned, called Four Corners, which I first proposed in 2004. I gave the keynote speech at World Press Photo in Amsterdam. And the idea was that you could hide information in each corner of the photograph. The bottom right corner, you could hide the caption, the code of ethics. From the photographer, you could even put in their website, so you could click on it and go and maybe buy the image for reproduction rights or whatever you want to do. The bottom left would be the backstory. So maybe there is a witness, who's interviewed. So here's a photograph of something that happened, and here's a witness talking about it who lives there. And the upper left was related imagery. So maybe there's a video of the same scene, or this is a photograph of an athlete, and here's another photograph of the same person at home with their family or something. So you have more context. And the upper right was links to other websites, which would delve more into the situation. So if you're photographing the Ukraine war, there's quite a few links to stuff that would give the reader more insight. It's also possible you could click on the photographer's name and go to their website. And do you trust this person? Is that somebody that you feel, oh, they worked for BBC, New York Times, they worked for Paris Match, they speak 7 languages, they've been doing it for 30 years. Maybe I'll trust that more than, some other person who has less experience, or maybe the other way around. So we've been pushing for these ideas so that the reader gets more context, supporting the photographer's integrity as a visionary, as somebody with a vision, as somebody who interprets situations as the credible witness using a camera, as opposed to just saying the camera never lies, F8 and be there, picture's worth 1,000 words, all these kind of mythology of the 20th century, because they certainly don't work anymore. It's so easy to fabricate imagery, to manipulate it, or to make photorealistic AI images that are impossible to tell, did that happen or not?
We keep coming up with the word manipulation, and there are many degrees of that. At what point do you consider a photograph manipulated? I'm not talking about taking dust marks off, but burning and dodging could be used in an editorial manner. If the burning and dodging is done right, you could change the look and meaning of a photograph, and it's been done before on magazine covers. We all know about it. At what point do we say it's been manipulated and not just cleaned up?
When I worked as a picture editor, I was the bridge between the photographer and the reader. I had to make sure that what the reader was looking at was not manipulated to such an extent that it distorted what was going on. So yes, we were able to crop. We could take out dust spots, we could burn and dodge, we could increase or decrease contrast, but it always had to be done in such a way that it wasn't changing the essential meaning of the photograph. So, for example, if Joe Biden is meeting with Vladimir Putin and Kamala Harris, you can't take off Kamala Harris. You can't just crop her out if she's at the same meeting. That's changing the essential what happened. You can't do that. You keep the 3 of them in. If you don't need the right side of the image because nobody's in it, sure, you could crop because you don't want to waste the space of the magazine. So yes, we made those decisions all the time, but the manipulation was you cannot change the essential meaning of the photograph. It's like quotation marks. I always think of the frame of the photograph as a quotation mark from the visible reality.
I like that.
So if you're quoting somebody, you certainly could take out a few words in the middle of the sentence and put a ... to indicate it, but you cannot take out the critical words that will change the whole meaning of the quote. We've been doing that for a very long time with words. If you're an artist, you don't have to worry about these sorts of issues because there's no assumption that what you're doing is trying to replicate a visual reality. You're not recording the visible. You're doing what you want to do. So if, for example, in your code of ethics, you say, I'm an artist, I do whatever I want, that's perfect. It's transparent. You're not fooling anybody. Just do it. Have fun. No problem.
Right. So there's a distinction between photojournalism and artistic photography, where we wouldn't necessarily want to apply that code of ethics that you referred to earlier to artistic photographers.
But there's some photographers who do both. Photojournalists who also have an art career. So just distinguish it.
Yeah. No, I mean photojournalism in that it's presented in a journalistic document. So yeah, the human being, of course, can do both types of work, but where that document gets presented to the audience is in a magazine or a journal of record.
If you're using something like AI in any way, for example, based upon predictions of urban planners in 20 years, this is what the neighborhood would look like. No problem, do it, but just be transparent and tell the viewer, that's what I've done. The same thing with climate change. Midtown Manhattan in 40 years will look like X, according to climate change scientists. I'm using AI to show that because photography cannot photograph the future. AI can make images that predict to a certain extent. They're not obviously foolproof. And maybe as a result, we change our environmental policies in New York City or elsewhere. So it can be very, very useful in multiple ways. If you want to do AI images of what the Paleolithic era looked like, there was no photographers in the Paleolithic era. Have fun. and just be transparent and just tell the viewer, this is what I'm doing. AI has enormously beneficial uses.
Right.
It just can't be confused by saying, yes, this is what happened, and pretending it's a journalistic documentary approach.
And do you see today ongoing nefarious attempts using AI-generated images to create a false narrative and propagating that narrative forward? Or just more simply, what's your take on how corrupting synthetic images have been to our understanding of what's true and real?
There's this concept of poisoning the well.
Mm-hmm.
And what it means is if you see the few AI images of things that look documentary, journalistic, you begin to be skeptical of all photographs. You don't want to be taken in again. And since, the last 2 years, I've made an enormous number of AI images, and I see how easy they are to make, I've become considerably more skeptical of photographs or what look like photographs. And I ask myself questions I didn't used to ask, which is, can I really trust this? In what ways, yes. Am I going to be made a fool of in that sense? So, for example, if it was the Vietnam War now, and they came up with the image of the execution of the Viet Cong or the girl burning from napalm, would 500,000 people take to the streets? Or would they say, oh, I'm not sure that's really a photograph. Did that really happen? It's really kind of far to go to Washington. Maybe I should forget it because I'm not really sure. I think that's one of the less visible but highly insidious results of what we're talking about. I think if you're a female celebrity at this point, you have to be terrified or at least concerned by deepfake videos. I just actually did the research a few minutes before we started talking. The number of sites that encourage people to make these videos, you stick in a photograph of somebody, it could be your teacher, it could be, the girl down the street, and they make either videos that are pornographic or the nudify software, which is already happening, like in middle schools, where boys are making, unfortunately, nude images synthetically of classmates, and you're traumatizing people. And as far as I know, there's no federal legislation in the US dealing with these kind of deep fake videos where you're putting people in scenes they never were part of. I'm kind of the canary in the coal mine. I do text prompts to see, will the AI systems allow, I want them to say, no, I will not make that image. So, for example, I put in Nazis giving out candies, to kids in the Warsaw Ghetto. It turned me down because of Nazis, so I put in fascists giving candies. No problem.
Right.
And I'm doing that because anybody could do the text prompt. It's not rocket science. You just write 8 words, 12 words, and see what comes out. And then you keep pushing it until it get you what you want. For example, I put in slave owners, 19th century America, and it started coming up with not only white slave owners, but black slave owners.
Right.
And I'm saying, where the hell are you coming from? What are you doing? Are people going to be putting this in textbooks and distorting history? And what are we doing about it? How are we controlling it? And once I start putting this stuff online, the new AI systems may well be training from my AI images. I don't put them online for the most part, but they could train with it and completely distort histories. And that is frightening.
A counterexample might be when Google's image generator really messed up and depicted the founding fathers as African American and black Nazis. Now, there was such an outcry against those mistaken renders that Google immediately took those searches or those results offline and fixed that mistake. I think there is an actual and real problem with kids traumatizing their classmates by creating sexualized images of them. But when it comes to these more popular, very politically incorrect results from image generation, the resulting hysteria and outcry compels the companies to patch those particular holes really quickly.
I think that's a very idealized version of it because much of it is open source. You could do it on your own. There's no guardrails. That's one part. Another part, for example, again, as a canary in the coal mine, the big AI companies announced with elections coming, we're not going to generate, political images. So immediately I just tried it. I said, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden at the beach. That's all I said. And it come up right away with them holding hands at the beach. I didn't ask for that. Nobody knows how the algorithms work. None of this could be 100% controlled. And all you need is a few of them slipping through and then getting published for the whole system of photography, video, and so on as credible witnessing to take an enormous hit.
Right.
Look at Facebook with all the years that parents have been complaining about social media, the kids being depressed. So, we're doing something about it. We're doing it. And then finally, it turns out these things are so big, they can't control everything. They don't have the staff to do it.
Right.
So these are platforms. These are not publications. When I worked at the New York Times, if we screwed up, we could be sued. These platforms are enormous, but they're not judged as publications. They're not held responsible for everything on them. And you're going to see, my opinion, more and more these very nefarious images coming up. And often the most nefarious images are the most subtle. The ones that just tweak the history a little bit, just change it a little bit, and nobody notices. For example, I was doing the March on Washington, which was a highly integrated march for civil rights. Martin Luther King gave his famous speech. And when I put in a Black person there, it made all the marchers Black. When I put in a white person, it made them all white. And that changes the nature of the civil rights movement. And they segregated out the people. I didn't ask for it. The algorithms do it.
So that, I think, is a really good point. This subtle modifying over time, incrementally, of images so that by the time the final form is rendered, everyone's sort of confused as to what's historically accurate. And there's almost like a artificial Mandela effect.
Exactly.
However, the example of an image of, President Biden and Vice President Harris holding hands at the beach, the problem with an image like that ever gaining traction is also part of this world that we live in which specifically I'm talking about everybody has a camera in their pocket, so that these really absurd images, if they're just one-offs, no one buys it. There's just too much potential corroborating photographs that aren't available for some of these really absurd images to gain traction and take off. It feels to me like.
No, I think, what happened in Gaza, I have a student of mine at ICP. He found the pro-Hamas and the pro-Israel social media. They both had a certain amount of fake imagery, and he pointed it out. A sizable response on both sides was, it really doesn't matter if the images are fake. We know what the truth is. And I think we're so fractured that even if it's an AI image showing something that never happened, people will say, that's true. We know it happened even though it didn't happen because it's true, because that's the reality we're living in, which is not a shared reality anymore. In the Vietnam War, you may be pro-war, anti-war, but again, when you saw a photograph of a girl burning from napalm, that's what happened. You could say, okay, that's part of war. You could say I'm against the war, but we had a common reality, a shared reality. And that we don't have anymore because whatever AI would fabricate, whether it's ChatGPT in terms of text, in terms of sound, in terms of image, it somehow proves the expectations of one group or another, whether or not it happened.
Alternatively, you can understand how in these propaganda channels online, these groups understand that, there were no photographers at that specific atrocity, but for our purposes, which is preaching to our already converted online masses, generating a representative image of an atrocity is good propaganda.
Well, it's a post-truth era. So in the post-truth era, a synthetic image holds, for many people, the same weight or more weight than a photograph. We come from a generation where the photograph proved things. Now that's not part of the conversation the way it used to be. Reality is fabricated. Reality is what we want it to be. It's consumer entitlement, in our own image. The name of my book, we want the world to prove our ideologies, our pre-expectations, and that's it. And if it doesn't show it, then we reject it as fake news. And that's the very difficult moment we're in. And the question is, how do we solve it? And, the answer has to be in multiple ways, including in schools.
On that note, I think this would be a great time to take a short break for traffic and weather. And we'll be back with, more with Fred Ritchin. Stay tuned.
When recording and storing high-resolution video, photos, and data, you need ultra-fast, safe, and reliable data storage. The Samsung T9 portable SSD meets those needs and more with its massive transfer speeds of up to 2,000 megabytes per second, a soft, protective exterior, and its ultra-compact size. The T9 is not only fast, it's compatible with the latest models of the Apple iPhone and Samsung Galaxy. It sports ultra-low power consumption with advanced thermal technology, and it comes in multiple capacities to choose from, making room for as much data as you need. Head on over to bnh.com for more information about the Samsung T9 and all their memory products, or use the link in our podcast show notes.
Okay, we are back with Fred Ritchin, and the discussion is AI, and it can't be more timely. And for the second half, I want to start off with a question that two photographers recently gained notoriety by entering images and then winning top award competitions. The first was Boris Eldagsen, who entered an AI-generated image in a competition for real photographs, and more recently, Miles Astray, who entered a real photograph in the AI category of a top competition, and yes, they both won. What's your take on these actions? Do these two cases help shed a light on credibility issues related to the divide between real and synthetic imagery?
I think both cases are challenges. In both cases, the photographer is challenging the judges. Can you tell the difference? You're esteemed people in the field, and they're both pointing out that we're at a crisis point. And in this crisis point, we have to start making definitions, delineating what kind of imagery are we talking about. So for me, for example, when I go to a bookstore or library, I know if I ask fiction, they'll send me to novels or poetry, and nonfiction, they'll send me to history, science, and so on. If you ask in photography, I want nonfiction photography, not fiction photography. We really have not had that vocabulary. We haven't really done the work to figure out what the difference is among them. Certainly we have documentary, but documentary could be stage documentary, conceptual documentary, personal documentary. There's all kinds of ways of looking at it that make it easy for the viewer to know what it is that we're talking about. In the old days, John Sarkowski did the Mirrors and Windows show at the MoMA, that the art photography is more like a mirror to the self, and the window, these documentary, more about the world. But those were kind of hazy concepts there. And I think what these two photographers are pointing out is that we really haven't grappled with these differences. What do we do about it? Just like your question before, when is manipulation too much? That should be simple. It should be said in two sentences so that every viewer, every reader, every photographer understands it. It doesn't mean that you can't manipulate, just be transparent. If you do, if it's in the journalistic documentary realm, we know the difference between a painting and a photograph. That's pretty clear. We know the difference between a poem and a news article. That's pretty clear. But I think what they're asking in these contests is what's good and what's bad on each? When are they useful? When is one preferable to the other? There's a case in Australia where refugees were incarcerated for a very long time, and there was this considerable amount of abuse that they reported, but there were no photographers and cameras for the most part. So a law firm took on the case, and they made AI images working with the different people who wanted to participate, describing what happened to them in the testimony, and said, is this what it looks like what happened? And when they did, they used it to make it visible, the abuse, which otherwise was invisible in a sense. And I think cases like that where AI itself can be quite useful. So I think these people, by, submitting their imagery, are really trying to start a debate, a discussion as to what should be allowed and not. The recent case with Adobe, again, with Ansel Adams, the estate was complaining that in the style of Ansel Adams, people were making synthetic images. And then finally, I think it was 8-9 months later, Adobe responded and said, it's not something we will allow. On another hand, you could say doing in the style of Ansel Adams is also a compliment to Ansel Adams, that I'm so inspired by his work. I want to do it in this style. I want to make environmental photographs. These are conversations we have to have. When is that a violation of the author's rights, of copyright, of the artist's rights? If I said I'm writing a novel inspired by Shakespeare, there's no problem with that. It's different than AI, though. So we have to have these conversations.
To that point, Midjourney has a library of styles and guides that includes hundreds of photographers who are named based on their style and showing synthetic images that anyone can make. I know of at least one photographer who's named in that style guide who didn't give permission for her name or her image style to be used in that context. What are your thoughts about the ethics of that?
Yeah, to me, that's sort of like fast food. It's not real food. It's like, just click on in the style of whoever and see what comes up. It's not done with seriousness, with respect, with, a sense of integrity. I think it's wrong to do that kind of in the style of all these people without asking permission. If you want to say, I want to do it in the style of Matthew Brady in the 19th century, who's not alive now, you could possibly argue differently. If you want to say, again, Ansel Adams, the great environmentalist, the Sierra Club, and I want to work in his style to help the environment in a serious way, you can make an argument for that. But I think, you just don't want to be in a situation where you're clicking and you're getting Cartier-Bresson decisive moment, click and I got it. I want to buy the camera that has the software that'll do it for me. To me, that's demeaning in many, many ways. I'll tell you, frankly, in 1984, I started writing about this. And when the Pyramids of Giza, the National Geographic cover, was changed 2 years previously, I interviewed the editor-in-chief of National Geographic, and he told me on the phone that really it's not much. All we do is go back in time and move the photographer a few feet to one side to get a different point of view.
Wow.
To me, I was stupefied. That idea, it's like science fiction.
Yeah.
Am I going to go back and move Cartier-Bresson? Am I going to go back and do that? I don't like that stuff. I think these things can be very, very problematic and can be done very cynically. But I think there are instances where you could say, I'm so inspired by somebody's work, and as an influence, I want to be able to use that and build on it and move it in different ways, not just, replicate it, but I want to do something different with it. Louis Hine with child labor. Can I use some of that work and use AI and figure out a way to help kids who are working today? What can I do? That could be an interesting research project. But a lot of this stuff is just commercial and gimmicky and highly problematic.
Yeah, and disrespectful to the photographer whose name is being used without their permission. I mean,
Well, they become commodities at that
Right.
point. Yeah.
Something that I've noticed from playing around with AI, and I've come up with some images that I absolutely love. And all the work that I do, I use my own photographs as the base. I work mostly in Firefly. And I've come up with some images that are they're delightful. I love them because I've always appreciated good illustration. And I've always been envious of illustrators because I can't illustrate. I can photograph, and some of my photographs look like illustrations, but I can't just take an airbrush or acrylics or whatever and just illustrate something. Now I can. But even with some of what I think are the coolest images I've come up with, I do not get the same personal satisfaction as I do of taking an original photograph that comes out exactly the way I saw it in my mind's eye, that I got it. And I could take credit for that. I can never take full credit for anything that I've done in AI because a lot of it is just like a slot machine to me.
I think you're right. It's chance. But for me, photography was in the dark room, seeing things the camera saw that I might have missed. If I'm working with a 28 millimeter lens on the street, I can't see everything in a fraction of a second. The camera will record stuff. Oh, I didn't realize, that there's a guy carrying a basketball behind the people I was photographing. I didn't think about that. Or that the tree was missing a branch. I didn't see that. I think of AI as conceptual. I think of photography as perceptual. And so I use it as a conceptual medium. And so I'll ask all these kinds of questions about the most beautiful woman in the world, or the smartest person, or the most creative woman, or whatever it would be. And I want to see what it comes up with, because maybe it'll give me ideas and help me rethink things. And that actually has happened quite often. I also do things like, let's say, make a street scene for me that looks like a photograph, but do it in the style of a jazz musician. Because I'm also interested that people we don't know of as photographers, but we know of their work, how does the AI translate that into image, or the other way around? If you're writing a short story in the style of Walker Evans, how would it come up with that? I think there's kind of a transmedia thing that AI is good at. Of course, a camera is not going to write a short story, but it can synergize, it can make these connections. And again, it's just experimental. It's just to see what it does. The way I use it is as a thought exercise. I'm not trying to commercialize it or inflict it on people or rewrite history. I just want to see what it comes up with. When I would sometimes photograph, I'd keep the camera waist high and make images without looking through the viewfinder, just to see what the camera saw that I may not have seen. And sometimes it was interesting and sometimes not. So I think there's a lot of ways to approach this. But again, I just go back to my point that we need terminology, we need definitions, we need to think these things through. And to Jill's point, also, we have to worry about the ethics of it. For example, in France, you have moral right. It's not copyright. In copyright, if 20th Century Fox or whoever has the copyright for the film, they could say, yes, no, you could colorize it. But in moral right, you also have to ask the director, it's a Woody Allen film. It was in black and white. Just because the studio owns it, in moral right, you also have to get the permission. I think it's the lead actor or actors and directors. So creative influences can't just be overlooked. So these are things I think we have to really think through and see if our laws, if our approaches are up to date for 2024, because you couldn't copyright a photograph. I think it's for about 35 years after it was invented, because it was thought of as being made by a camera. It was mechanical. There was no creativity in it. And then eventually the Supreme Court decided it could be creative. That was a big change. And I think we're going to have some of those difficult questions right now. Can AI eventually be copyrighted? And can you get a good feeling from it? Sometimes I do. And sometimes I find it's repugnant. It's just horrific.
One thing that I've been starting to think about a lot with this conversation is the idea of visual literacy, especially because everybody's a photographer. Not everybody has a good understanding of visual literacy, like a professional photographer or somebody who's, active in the creative field. Do you think we need to change or adapt our approach to teaching about visual literacy because of AI?
Well, not only adapt it, I think we have to start teaching it. We teach literacy to do with words, but for the most part, media literacy is not taught. It has to include things like, was the photograph made by an insider or an outsider? What period was it made? All these kinds of literacy issues. In the 19th century, you had tripods and large format cameras, and you had to pose for a long period of time. People have to know all those things as well. It's not just a question of AI versus, Photoshop versus film and just the technical issues. It's a bunch of issues. And they do it in countries like Finland. Kids at a very young age, they sit around, they say, can we believe this image? Why yes? Why no? What do you think? And then eventually they become informed consumers and they ask these questions. But, frankly, advertising falls apart then because you're not going to buy a car because a good-looking man or woman standing next to it. If you have media literacy, you realize that it has nothing to do with the value of the car. The car could fall apart. in 6 months. It doesn't matter if a good-looking woman or man is standing next to it. And advertising hopes that you don't have the media literacy to see through the guys. The same thing with politics. It works in a similar way. So yes, we need media literacy, not only for the kids, but for their parents, for the whole family, starting at a very early age. I think we have to be prepared for this stuff.
So yeah, Fred, it seems to me that we're living in a postmodern, post-truth world where there's absolute information overload. And I think a lot of people have fallen back to rely on legacy media institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post, for example. So I guess my question would be, in terms of the people who work in those institutions, do you feel that at least those folks are up to speed and have the media literacy that you're talking about? And then also, what's your opinion of the effectiveness of the C2PA camera authenticity regimes that we're starting to see being implemented?
Those are two very big questions that you're asking. I think my response is, I think that basically every newspaper and magazine that wants to be respected as a credible source of news needs to, in a very prominent way, make clear what their policy is. We publish these kinds of photographs or videos and not those. And if we do publish the second sort, we will be transparent. We will tell you. And for those of you who don't know what AI is, click on this here and we'll show you a demonstration. And they should be doing that quite regularly so that people know. For example, I'm involved in a lot of these discussions with journalistic organizations. And then sometimes I point out to very reputable publications, you just did a story on AI images and you label them photographs. They're not photographs. But your photo department, whoever is writing this, needs to be very, very clear with the reader and with themselves what the differences are. And in a 24/7 news cycle, of course you can make mistakes, but this has to be at the top. The problem with things like the New York Times or BBC and so on is that there are an awful lot of people who don't really care about those kinds of news sources. They get their sense of the world from social media. It's much more tribal. It's stuff they already believe. It reinforces their ideology. And those systems don't have those kinds of guidelines or desire for those guidelines. So I think at some level, whether it's federal or local, there has to be some way in which, like false advertising, for example, there's something that happens when you do something to deceive, to distort on purpose. Do you lose your license? In the old days, the Federal Communications, you could lose your license if you're a radio station. How do we try to control this in some way? Do the big, Metas and X and so on, do we make them more responsible? It's really a big set of issues that involves legal penalties. Again, if I quote somebody and it's not a quote, there are repercussions. If it's an invasion of copyright, there can be repercussions. There could be a lawsuit. We need things like that. I think the attempts like C2PA, the Content Authenticity Initiative that's spearheaded by Adobe with BBC, Associated Press, New York Times, and all that, is cryptographic. And the idea is that a reader should be able to click through an image and see the ways it was changed. For an insurance company, that's great. That really works forensically before a judge. That's amazing. But what you're doing is you're inviting people to distrust photographs. In other words, when I was a picture editor, I would never want people clicking through the image and saying, oh, they darkened the cloud on the upper right, so the massacre never happened. Do people have the media literacy to know which kind of changes are minor, major, and so on? And in fact, what you're doing is you're opening it up for everybody to feel like they have to interrogate the process. As a writer, if I'm quoting somebody in a sentence, there is no way I'm releasing the 3-hour transcript of the interview.
Right.
just so that the viewer could be assured that I quoted something that's representative. They have to trust me. They have to trust my editors. They have to trust the publication. And the same with the photographer. So to a certain extent, I think it can diminish the role of the photographer by opening them up to this kind of inspection as to what was changed or not.
I wonder, could it not be seen as medicating the well? So instead of poisoning the well, we're medicating the well. And so, yeah, for a few of these pictures, people might click through all the way and sort of see a lot of arcane information regarding the provenance of these photographs. But then when they see other photographs in the future tagged that certain way, they'll understand that it's a heuristic for a lot of painstaking attempts to corroborate its authenticity. And so we can build these heuristics for trust.
Or on the other hand, you could say, here's a photograph of so-and-so politician paying a bribe. But in going through the photograph, we realized, the cloud was darkened. So we don't trust the image. We put it on social media. Don't trust the press. They hate the politician. They're awful. They change the image to prove it. Of course, how many people are then going to go click through to see that that makes no sense? I don't think it's useful, except for the editor. If I was an editor still, and the photographers in the field, and I'm using the cryptographic approach, yes, I might go through and see if they made any changes. And if I find that they changed the color of the guy's shirt in it used to be blue and now it's orange, I could reject it. I won't work with the photographer. But the reader then has to trust me that I made those decisions. It's like you go to the doctor. The doctor says, this is what's wrong with you. And then, you go to 12 websites to find out maybe the doctor's wrong. There has to be a level of trust in the professionals that they're doing what's supposed to be doing. You're not opening them up for the accusations all the time. Go back to your initial question about Adobe. Are we asking for all their sales figures? Are we asking for all the transcripts of the meetings when they come up with a new software? No, we're not. They do what they do. So why are they opening it up this way? I understand your point. And for certain people, it will work, but for a lot of people, it won't.
Is there an alternative to C2PA that that you endorse, that you think could be effective?
There's a lot of companies working with watermarks. There's also a lot of software and YouTube videos and so on telling you how to take the watermarks off.
Right.
On top of that, what I think is wrong is that, Simon & Schuster doesn't have its own copyright symbol and Random House a different one. They all agree it's one symbol. So if you have all these different companies, Google, Stability Diffusion, whatever it would be, if they're working with the watermarks, for a viewer's point of view, they should all be the same, in the same place, recognizable, and so on. None of them are foolproof. And often what happens in a lot of these monitoring software, what they do is they tag the actual photographs as being false, not the AI. None of them are near 100%. So again, that's how you poison the well. You just need a few errors. And, trust is hard to rebuild once it's been broken.
Something that I want to go back to again, we spoke earlier about prompting, which is what a lot of AI technology has to do. And you have been playing around with it like most of us have. Have you found any, I hate to use the word tricks, but any suggestions on the best, most efficient way to create prompts? Is it better to keep them simple? Is it more elaborate that you want to have? Are there any key rules that you have found seem to work real well to give you more accurate or results closer to what you're trying to achieve?
One rule I've found is if it works today, next week it may not work.
Oh, so it's like life.
For example, I was working with DALL-E for a long period of time, and there was about a 3-month period where it was extraordinary. I was getting amazing results. I was so happily surprised. And then I'd go back, and it became more and more conventional and less interesting for a certain period of time. It may have come back in certain ways. What a lot of people try to do with prompts is to get exactly what they want. My approach is the opposite. I'm leaving latitude for the AI to make its own decisions. I don't want to say every part of the image what I want it to be. I'm just giving it a general idea. In the book I wrote, when I was picture editor of the New York Times Sunday magazine, sometimes I would give a photographer an assignment, which I knew had to be done. It's a photograph of a writer. We need the person in their office, the typewriter, the desk, the books, whatever. But then I say, surprise me. You're there and I'm not there. And maybe you'll see something or feel something. Surprise me. And maybe we'll run the picture, maybe we won't. I can't promise, but surprise me. Just don't do what I want you to do or tell you to do. Use your own intuition and so on. And I was often surprised. It was wonderful when it worked. I remember Norman Mailer, I think it was the photographer John Franco, and there he was on his motorcycle, with his helmet. I said, wow, that's fantastic. A writer is not at his desk. He's on his motorcycle. And I think with AI, the same thing. I remember I did something like a child's view of a successful writer. And all it gave me was images of successful children who are writers. I wasn't asking for that. I was asking for children seeing adults. But it was giving me all these great children writers. I was so happy because it gave me what I didn't think I wanted, but I actually did want because I didn't know I wanted it. So, I use it often that way, giving it a lot of latitude. I'm not a designer for an ad campaign who wants the upper left corner to be this and the upper right corner that. That's not what I'm doing. I'm using it as a partner, a collaborator. And sometimes it comes up with really interesting things and sometimes it doesn't. But I like that sense of accident. Again, that's what drew me to photography. It wasn't that I could preordain the image. It was that I released the shutter and the image that came out often could be surprising.
That's cool.
One thing I found is that it could be scary and it could also be fun. I've been doing an on and off series on park benches and trees. And it's a pretty long series already. And I decided to use prompts to add to the series to see if I could create images that would equal what I was doing. And I was floored by the images that were coming up because I'd be able to take these pictures and blend them in with my photographs. And I don't think anybody would be able to pick up on it. I was able to nail it.
But what do you call the image then?
Photo promptograph.
I thought you called them photo illustrations.
Well, yeah, it could be also called a photo illustration, but I don't call it a photograph. It's not. I mean, I'll call it a promptograph, photo promptograph. That's what I have been using. And it's clunky. We're going to have to come up with something slicker than that. I know that.
Yeah.
But for the time being, when I do have these images go up, they're noted as what they are.
Right. No, I agree with you 100%. It's just like, I think the terms we come up with could be really interesting and much more, definitive. And so it's a kind of a hybrid that you're doing, which is a very interesting hybrid.
Well, if it's just prompts, I would say it's a promptograph. I think it's a fair word and it's literal. But if I use my own photographs as the basis for both the composition and the color palette and the texture, I try to get as many of my own images into these. So there I put the photo dash promptograph. And that to me is pretty expressive, a lot of syllables.
I go for whitesograph or elanogram. I don't know.
An elanogram.
Elanogram. Ooh, baby, I love it. Okay.
When I was interviewed by the Columbia Journalism Review, we worked out what to call some of the AI images they published, and it begins, this is a synthetic image, comma, not a photograph, comma, generated in collaboration with the author in response to the text prompt, and naming the AI system. But we wanted to be really clear, not just it's a synthetic image because people don't know what that means, but also that it's not a photograph, because these were more documentary. But I like what you're doing. I like that kind of hybridization of different forms and playing with it and seeing where we go. In that sense, it's a renaissance. We have more possibilities than ever before. We should be actually really happy about it and using them in different ways. You can't photograph a dream, but you could certainly make synthetic images of what you remember of a dream. It could be phantasmagoric. It could do all kinds of stuff and could really be fun. But again, I think the crisis is the mixing it up and the diminishing of the credibility of the photograph.
Mm.
I believe in one of the articles that I read while prepping for this, you mentioned that there were some Holocaust survivors that were asked to tell stories of trauma from earlier in their life, and they used AI to illustrate these.
Yeah, it was in the city of Ashkelon. It was I believe it was an old age home, and they were asking them, when you were in Europe as a child, could you talk about the most traumatic episode? And they made AI images in an exhibit. You could understand therapeutically that could be great. People say, "Oh my God, that happened to you. I'm so sorry. Tell me more about it." Suddenly you have a history that's more visible. But then, one of the major Israeli newspapers said, but at the same time, it's undermining our sense of history. And if you take it the next step, I could be the grandson of a Nazi, and I could do the same thing and show how my grandfather was this great guy and he played football with the prisoners. The history then becomes highly, highly malleable.
But what's the difference between doing what we just described, where having somebody talk about something from their past and using AI to illustrate what it probably appeared? What's the difference between that and having an illustrator listen to these and create illustrations? The New York Times does it every single week in the magazine section. They'll have an illustrator illustrate the story. But now we have AI that can do it, as long as the viewer could know that it is AI and not real photographs.
That's the problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
One can be misinterpreted as
Yeah.
a document
Yeah.
of a real event, and one can't.
Whereas an illustration in a magazine, it's an illustration. In a
Yeah, if it
magazine.
looks like a photograph,
drawing.
people assume it's a photograph, and then you end up distorting histories and actually re-victimizing people, because then their abusers can be made out to be, nice people that they weren't, and off the hook in that sense. No, it's at the very beginning. Photography started in 1839 with daguerreotypes and so on, and I think we're kind of in 1841 in terms of AI. We're just beginning.
Yeah.
And we're feeling our way. And, as you started the broadcast, Paul Delaroche said painting is dead. He was completely wrong. We got Impressionism, Cubism, Minimalism, Abstract Expressionism. Photography liberated painters not to be representational and to go with their imagination, their intuitions, be expressive. And you could argue that AI can do some of the same things with photography and so on and so forth. It could open up new vistas in really good ways, but it's just at the very beginning of it. But unfortunately, the world we're in, there's a lot at stake in figuring this out quickly in terms of, with the issue of witnessing.
Yeah. In our last AI-related episode with Stephen Shanklin in February of 2024, we ended up doing a follow-up interview with him because of OpenAI's release of the Sora text-to-video model while the episode was still in post-production. It was the first time we ever had a guest return to the show on the same show. It was kind of fun. Now, that said, you have a new book, The Synthetic Eye, Photography Transformed in the Age of AI, and it's on press right now. We're looking forward to it. Given the speed at which AI technology is evolving, do you feel that parts of this book might become dated or obsolete before its release?
Well, it's about to go on press, but no, look, this is the fourth book I've done on the future of imaging in a digital environment. I just reread the piece I wrote in 1984 for the New York Times Magazine, and it was saying something like, in the future, we'll have possibly synthetic actors, dead actors who could be reconstituted to act in films. I think the sentence I wrote then in 84 was something like, in the future, we may well have to ask the photographer, is an image fiction or nonfiction, because we won't be able to tell the difference. That's 40 years ago. So, yes, some of the technologies change and get better and quicker or slower. The general principles remain in terms of whether it's video or still, and you're using AI. Yeah, certainly they can be used in different ways. And a lot of young people, from my experience, don't particularly believe photographs, believe more videos, if they believe at all. So you're now going into a different medium. But the principles are the same. You could synthesize, you can make up stuff that never happened. You could show things in different ways. The principles are there, whether you do that completely in a synthetic image, partially as a synthetic image. The idea is that we're getting the world to look the way we want it to look, as opposed to using a camera to show the recording of the visible as it is. We've never said photographs are truth. They're always interpretations, but they have been viewed as recordings of the visible. That no longer is the case. What do we do about it? So, no, I'm not worried about so much stuff happening. My concern, frankly, is the opposite. Why is there so little resistance in the field knowing this stuff was coming? Why didn't journalists band together in the 80s and 90s? What do we do about it? This could be great, software and so on. But just your question, when are we going too far? Why it was Taylor Swift being put into a deepfake video that suddenly got politicians waking up.
It's like climate change. It takes something real radical to make people wake up,
It's like Rock Hudson with AIDS. Ronald Reagan woke up. That was a friend of his, back then. But we're a lot smarter than that. We certainly can invent AI. We can invent Photoshop. We can invent amazing camera technologies. You see, if you're in a community of your own family, you do things to protect your family. You say the ceiling has to be replaced. We're not going to wait for it to fall down. You do it. It's your family. That sense of community, I think, is what's missing. This is better for the American people. This is better for the world, whether it's climate change, AI, or whatever it is. And that's a major reason we don't do these things, because we're trained to be, and consumer capitalism is self-centered. Are you happy? Do you get the Big Mac? Do you get what you want? Yeah, then the world is fine. But my question from the beginning has been, who loses when the photograph is no longer credible? Well, it's the victims of massacres, the victims of famine, the victims of earthquakes, victims of war. We don't have to worry about them anymore because the imagery is not credible. So, we could just pretend they don't exist. They're the ones who lose the most, and we're more insulated. For wealthier people, it's easier. And I think of all those people dying of extreme heat right now, and they're certainly paying the price. Those of us who can sit in air conditioning, we're a bit insulated. And I think it's similar with AI and so on. It's not ruining our lives, but it certainly is. When I did a Salgado show and ICP ran it, and the Doctors Without Borders used it to open up their North American headquarters at the time. They later won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And the issue was, without a photograph, they couldn't prove a massacre. Nobody cared. You needed it. So without credible photographs, there are no massacres because nobody cares. That kind of thing. That's what concerns me.
Fred, I only have 7 more pages of questions, so please bear with me.
But who wrote the questions? You or AI?
I wrote them.
Good question. I'm all joking aside. This is a topic that we can just go on for a long time. I say that often, but the truth is, the more you talk, the deeper it gets, and the answers are very difficult to come up with. And we're going to find them as we go along. We really appreciate your insight. Obviously, you've had a heads up on this for a while. You saw it coming way back when. Many of us did. You truly recognized it and started discussing it and asking questions about it. And it's nice to know that you still are. I'm looking forward to your new book. In addition to the book, is there anything else going on right now that our listeners should know about?
When I was a picture editor of the New York Times Magazine, I really loved the job. It was very much about witnessing and showing what's going on around the world. And then eventually, as I moved out of that kind of a role, I moved much more into how can imagery be used by NGOs, by humanitarian organizations. I worked on a campaign to end polio worldwide with UNICEF, WHO. Salgado was a photographer. I worked on the Millennium Development Goals. For kids around the world, they should have clean water and education and electricity and so on. And one thing that we don't talk about is the positive impact of photography on the world. So, for example, Gideon Mendel's a South African-born photographer, and there's a feeling in Western governments and NGOs that to give antiretroviral medicines to HIV-positive people in Africa was a risk because they weren't sure they were disciplined enough to take them regularly, which was incredibly racist and stupid. So Gideon went to a pilot project in South Africa for 4 years and photographed. People took them, they got better, they were healthy, they were able to work, take care of their kids. And I asked UNAIDS, what was the impact? And the response was 8 million people are now on treatment, to a large extent because of this kind of work. And the same when I worked Millennium Development Goals. I did a study. There are 21 to 27 million people alive, largely in Africa, who wouldn't have been without those campaigns. So we know that photography can be helpful, can push forward. So I've co-curated a number of shows on the war in Ukraine. I'm working on a book now on Ukraine with Maxim Dundiuk, a Ukrainian photographer. I'm working on different kinds of projects like that. I'm always looking for ways that imagery can be useful, helpful in the world, and what kinds of imagery you have to make in order to be helpful. So the idea is you can't give up. You have to keep doing it. You have to keep pushing it. And often this stuff is successful. So I'm working on things like that all the time. I teach that kind of stuff, image-based strategies for human rights. How do you push it forward? That's what I'm looking for, to put into practice these ideas, to go beyond the issues of AI and software, whatever, into ways that can be effective. And often photography and imaging is still very effective on local levels where there's a greater degree of trust. And I think more and more all of us have to take advantage of that to try to push us to a better place, because certainly the world needs it.
And what do you do in your spare time? You're a busy man. Is there a website that our listeners could visit to catch up on a lot of these?
It's called thefifthcorner.org. The fifth corner being photographs have four, so it's kind of a meta look at it. There's a lot of the talks and writing. I highlight a lot of projects, and there's a lot of essays I've written online, Vanity Fair, Vogue, and
which I've been reading, and they're well worth the time. I suggest our listeners read some of these. There's some interesting insights, goes into depth of a lot of the topics that we just touched on today, and well worth the time. Fred Ritchin, thank you so much for joining us. I was really looking forward to this conversation. I still have a lot of questions left, and maybe we'll catch up on another time. But we really want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your ideas on a very, very hot topic.
No, I appreciate it. And I appreciate the many, many really smart ideas that came out. So from you guys and all of us. So thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. It's been a pleasure.
If you are a fan of the show, but not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or B&H's YouTube channel, wherever you get your podcasts, and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos of our guests and show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast Group, where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. I'm your host, Alan Weitz. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Our executive producer is Sean Steiner. And on behalf of all of us, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Samsung for sponsoring this week's episode.